you're born in Ireland and you live in Brussels, and you have an artist duo office for joint administrative intelligence. We
Right.
have to talk about that later. This name is already grabbed the attention. And you also write a book about artists who self-identifying themselves as kind of institutions.
Yeah.
That's also one point. And you are also a lecturer in La Cambre, and also, of course, has a lot of artist practices. Maybe one thing what is interesting and going immediately in the middle of your artistic process is that in one time you mentioned that you, at a certain point, you moved from more static art from more performance art. And that's interesting for me because sometimes in the old-fashioned way, the static art, I mean, usually static art is oil painting. But later, everyone wants to move something more or something more meaningful. Some people just change the oil to tempera or something else. But you moved from static to dynamic to performances. How this has happened?
Because objects and drawings couldn't do what I need them to do. And also potentially maybe I wasn't very good at them. There was a moment when I realized that language and talking and storytelling and physical action were much more efficient ways to create worlds than mark making or sculpting or something like this. So the use of language and physical gesture has been really prominent in my work over the last few years. I never fully gave up making things though, and I continue, and there's been a return in fact to making things in the last year or so. Because I feel there's sometimes a physical need to make things. Because you can resolve conflict when you make a print or when you're drawing or when you're producing something physical. It's not about what you're trying to express or what you're trying to emotionally resolve. It's that conflict, informational disjoint can be resolved through these processes.
Do you want to influence others? Because a lot of people starting artistic processes because they want to influence others.
The fact that I bring my work into the public space and that, I'm a radio maker and performer and lecturer. Clearly there is a desire for my work to function in a social domain, to do some work in the world and on other people, sure, but my primary objective is not to influence other people. If I wanted to influence other people, I'd be in politics, or I'd be in lobbying, or I'd be in finance, or I'd be an activist, or I'd be a terrorist. I'm not sure that I would be. I think that if influencing was my primary motivation, I think that art would probably be one of the least efficient ways to achieve that goal.
I need the paper for that. That joint administrative intelligence. It sounds like the FBA or the CIA or something like that. Maybe that was also a purpose, I guess. But what you're doing is performances, installations, publications, radio shows. So do we have to talk about bureaucracy when we talk about this joint administrative intelligence, or do we have to talk about funds, or do we have to talk about tunnels?
People get confused about bureaucracy because they treat it as a subject matter. And historically, bureaucracy recurs in art since the 1960s and 70s as a subject matter. To some degree, we're interested in bureaucracy as a subject matter. The idea of archivage and collecting and approving and discriminating certain kinds of material. Predominantly, we see bureaucracy as a method. It's a method to gather things. It's a method to put things systematically in relation to one another. It gives us the possibility to make certain things move faster and things move slower, to activate certain things and to close certain things down. So when people think about bureaucracy, they think about businesses or banks, but bureaucracy is anything that is put into systemic action is done so via a process of bureaucracy. You could do some of the most heinous things in the history of the world, some really dark things and some really dark modes of oppression can be produced through bureaucratic methods, but also if I wanted to give everybody in Belgium $1 million, I'd have to use a bureaucratic method to do it. Because who and how and what the logistics of that would be.
In that meaning, for example, when Judith Riegel is a Hungarian-born French painter died, gallerist and some friends made a foundation. And in that foundation, of course, there were secretary, there were archivists, and a lot of other people. That is also a kind of bureaucracy. When they published the catalog resume, the big catalog which contains all the paintings that the person this ever made, that's also a kind of bureaucratic thing. So in this way, it is also an artistic process when you do that, if you want to collect and you want to archive your things.
Yeah.
But people tend to mention bureaucracy as a state-owned, absolutely miraculously unneeded things.
I think those people are lacking imagination when they think about the word bureaucracy. I don't associate with this necessarily with the state. I see it as a method for conjuring material in the world and putting things in place in the world. And that can be used for boring purposes. It could also be used to arrange and to put in place a desire to work with tunnels and a desire to work with pornographic films shot in proximity to modernist architecture and attempts to dialogue with, let's say, the dead. All of these things can be uploaded into a bureaucratic frame and made resonate with one another.
So you are in this bureaucracy or joint administrative?
So OJAI uses some bureaucratic methods so that we can make our desires function in an integrated way. But we're also interested in institutionality, like you described with that artist in Hungary, which is what architecture are we trying to produce? And that's the Office for Joint Administrative Intelligence, which people get caught up on the fact that it sounds like the KGB or the FBI or the CIA or the Mossad, which I mean is clearly an intentional playing with the optics of power that we've deliberately decided to engage with. But actually our intelligence agency is a container inside which all of our desires can live and be structured and can be put to work in the world.
I still want to be in this topic because I want to understand in the best way that it's a kind of engineering process when you try to want to sort everything in order and in the right order. But can we do this in our society? I'm not sure.
I don't know whether it can be done in society. I know that two people or a group of people can do this, and they can decide what the right way is. The question might also be, because we're using sort of stamps and typed documents and folders, the question might be, why are we using a sort of materially dead, necrotic type of bureaucracy that really hasn't existed since the end of the Cold War or maybe the 1990s? You know, it's not an app, it's not the cloud, it's not supercomputing. Our version of bureaucracy contains a strong material sense. We like the physical sensation of documents and materials and architecture. And so we have a pathological desire to structure, but we also feel really rooted in the material world.
That one I can understand. I mean, when you're talking about materials and art is always dependent on each other. And also when I just mentioned with the archiving thing, it's also very important to have at least a storage place, even if you are not really interested in doing everything in order. You work with a Berlin-based artist.
Yeah.
And so you are very international in that way, because you always have have exhibitions in different countries. And you, just before the interview, you mentioned that you like small places, so not the big cities like Berlin and Amsterdam and London, but you tend to go to Charleroi, tend to go to smaller places to exhibit. And why is that?
I mean, not always to exhibit, although that does happen, but to find material and to find communities that we can collaborate with. The German artist I work with is Chris Dreier, who's a photographer and was and an experimental musician working in Berlin since the 1980s. And we have come to the conclusion, or at least it's been our experience, that that the kinds of discourse and the kinds of scenes that are constructed in London and Berlin and Dublin and, well, whether Dublin's a centre or not, I don't know, but in these large central cities, people tend to be reading the same things, people tend to be on the same discursive script, the same exhibitions and the same artists tend to travel to these cities. Hello. The same artists and the same exhibitions tend to travel to these cities. So in some ways there's sort of there's something homogeneous in the metropolitan values of these places, with some variation. But when you step into peripheral space or into places that don't designate themselves as centers, you tend to find that there are much more pronounced regional variations on what people are looking at and how people are looking at it and how people are shaping community around their work and what kind of infrastructures they're building.
In this matter, do you want to also educate your audience or absolutely not?
I want to tell them stories, and I want to bring them, if they're willing to go along with it, I want to bring them on journeys, yeah, but educate them, no.
Okay, we are in a tunnel, so let's talk about tunnel affection performance. You can tell the story about that. It was in Berlin, ICC pedestrian tunnel, in Charlottenburg, Wilmersdorf.
So this was an Office for Joint Administrative Intelligence performance program in 2002. And so in Berlin, running between the bus station and the International Conference Center, there's a beautiful, pristine pedestrian tunnel with bright orange tiles and futuristic light fixtures and really kind of high social democratic modernist architecture built for people to use, built for the public to use. A generosity on behalf of the governing powers, something like this. And this tunnel has become somewhat irrelevant because the ICC tunnel no longer, there's no longer a conference center. So the tunnel goes nowhere. But it produces a perfect underground space for performative assembly. So myself and Chris, under the banner of Office for Joint Administrative Intelligence, decided that we would construct a performance program that would bring the public down into this tunnel and co-opt the space as a venue. We also performed a renaming ceremony on the tunnel. We thought that there was something really tragic about such a generous public space being designated ICC tunnel, so we performed a ritual changing the name of the tunnel to the Patrick Cowley tunnel.
Okay, maybe I'm not.
So Patrick Cowley is one of the first synthetic musicians from the 1970s, and he is one of the first victims of the AIDS pandemic in the United States. And a lot of his work was soundtracks for gay pornographic films in the late 70s, early 80s. And a lot of that material was totally destroyed and lost and has slowly been coming back together. And so Patrick Farrelly really, I think, would have been somebody quite significant if the AIDS crisis hadn't completely destroyed the community that he was working in. His work would have been more known. So we see it, one of the things that we can do by attaching his name to that tunnel and by talking about him and making radio about him, is to sort of reify his work or bring him back a little bit, bring the work back from the dead. And this is another thing that the Office for Joint Administrative Intelligence is busy with, is the idea of quite precise, bureaucratized, well, pseudo-bureaucratic ways of dealing with the dead. And dealing with dead heroes, politicians, freedom fighters, architects, artists. We have a sort of a general assembly of dead figures that we keep around us.
Yeah, basically that's culture. I mean, what you pick up from the history, and well, you can talk about literature or other things, other types of arts, but what you're picking up just for yourself is very, very interesting and very influence on the way you see things. Let's name, I don't know, Byron, Lord Byron. Mm-hmm. He's definitely in the literature history, but is personally interesting for you or not? And in this manner, I can imagine that your list of dead people can be an absolutely personalized list of the important people.
Yeah, they range from being quite centrally, historically important to being very obscure. And we see them as, heroes or collaborators or advisors. And so again, this destabilizes this notion of the institution as something grey and systemic, something associated with developmentalist politics or capitalism. We see our institution as a large, haunted house, broadcasting facility, quite perverse archive, gathering and broadcasting based on the algorithm of our shared desires.
Before the interview, you mentioned that you absolutely you are absolutely love of tunnels, and one other thing, and I want to guess now what could be the other thing, because you talk about a lot in sound design and things like that. Mm-hmm. So is it something around that or not? Absolutely not.
No, my earliest artistic obsession that continues to reverberate to this day is airports, airport terminals, as sort of as places of unrestrained architectural megalomania, places where you don't have to think about nature or neighbors, that the architectural impulse can kind of almost spread like cancerous cells and kind of gets added onto and produces layers and layers and layers of architectural surplus. I mean, this keeps me awake at night with excitement, and also the airport as a complex bureaucratic organism where political and ecological and commercial and class-based and geopolitical stories get told, but in a highly synthetic environment. I mean, I don't think there could be much more interesting than an airport.
Well, thank you very much for the discussion.